Hi, everyone. Welcome to the March 20th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to handicap some upcoming weekend stakes races from the fairgrounds, Oaklawn Park, and Santa Anita. Obviously, the main focus this week is on the fairgrounds, with their big race being the Louisiana Derby on Saturday. We'll also talk about 3 of the undercard stakes races, a 3-year-old sprint race from Oaklawn Park, and 2 turf stakes races from Santa Anita. And Craig, that's assuming that all of these tracks maintain their schedules this weekend and are expected to run as planned as of today, as we're recording this at about noon on Friday. But I know that a lot is moving right now and things are subject to change. But as of now, we're going to assume that all tracks are running tomorrow.
Yeah, that's all we can really do. I mean, the news is coming fast and heavy, and, hopefully we can offer a little diversion and that at least some of these races get run, hopefully all of them, of course. But, we'll just play it by ear like everybody else. Racing kind of taking a backseat to everything else as it should. But, as I mentioned, hopefully it's just a little diversion at least.
Yeah, let's hope that we can get a few more races in this weekend, but our main focus obviously is hoping that everyone stays safe and that people are able to conduct racing this weekend and be healthy while doing it. So let's hope that stays that way for as long as possible. Let's get into the handicapping, and we'll begin at Fairgrounds this weekend. On Saturday, we're going to talk about 3 of those undercard stakes before getting to the Louisiana Derby, beginning with race 8 on the card. It is the Tom Benson Memorial, going 1 mile and 1/16 on the turf for the fillies and mares. And this race features a rematch of a couple of fillies coming out of the Jersey Lily Stakes from Sam Houston back in January. That day, Winning Envelope got the better of Dream Passage. Winning Envelope got a really perfect trip, closing from the back of the pack to get up that day, going away by about 3.5 lengths. This time, though, the pace situation could be a little different, and that might help Dream Passage.
Yeah, as people who have listened to the show know, obviously I was a big part of making the pace projector, but I mean, that doesn't always mean that I follow it exclusively and always agree with it even. It's an algorithm that, it's not going to be perfect in every situation, but this race is one where I definitely agree with it. There is no pace in this race outside of Dream Passage, none at all. She faced some pretty heavy pace pressure last time. The fractions weren't quite in red, but they were definitely quick. She was pressured. She was actually a little bit off the lead for a long part of the way, and Winning Envelope was able to take full advantage of that. But it just looks like a totally different scenario here. I think her pace edge is huge. She has the top rider on the circuit in Florent Giroux, especially on turf, red hot trainer in Brad Cox. And I just think she is strictly the horse to beat. I don't think that 9-2 morning line is realistic. I would expect her to be in the 5-2 to 3-1 range. But even that, I think, is probably right on the borderline of offering some pretty good value given the setup.
Yeah, I've got to say the weirdest thing to me coming out of that Jersey Lily, looking back at that race, was that Dream Passage was only 3-2 in that race compared to Winning Envelope's 2-1. Because if you look at their respective form lines coming into that race, kind of would have thought that Dream Passage would be an odds-on favorite that day. For whatever reason, they were pretty lukewarm betting her, and she maybe underperformed a little bit. Though I thought Dream Passage actually ran pretty well in defeat, because that was a race that was mostly dominated by closers, and she was up contesting the pace the entire way. I do think Dream Passage is a mare that is best when she gets a clear lead, like we saw her get 2 back at Aqueduct, and she just dominated a race of some overmatched horses going a mile, that in that optional claiming company. I think she's going to be clear in the lead here, as you said, according to the pace projector. That's what seems is likely to play out, and I just think that's going to make her really tough to run down. I agree, we're not going to get that 9-2, but we really shouldn't, because she's got a speed figure edge over this field, and I think she's classy enough to beat this group. Winning Envelope's obviously in good form, but like I said at the top, she just got that absolutely perfect trip last time. I mean, she was a rep towards the back of the pack coming about by the 3/8 pole, and Julien Leparoux just hugged the rail. Everything broke the way that it should have for her. She got a clear seam to run through in the stretch and was able to run them down. Just hard to envision her getting that exact same trip in this field. As for the others, I mean, I guess the main third player in this race is Altia, who is the morning line favorite here. Altia is just the kind of horse that I'm never too interested in. She has had a lot of chances. She doesn't win that often, usually picks up some minor checks. I know she's coming off her career best performance. I just don't trust her to get the job done.
Yeah, I'm with you. And you know she's going to take money being trained by Chad Brown. I don't have a whole lot to add other than want to pick up on something you said about the speed figures of Dream Passage. That's one thing I definitely look for is a difference between dirt and turf. When a horse has a pace advantage on dirt, I'm more likely to give them a break if they don't have the speed figures because that will give them an edge. But I'm not so much so to do so on turf. You know, for example, a horse who's just overmatched and looks to make the lead on turf, they just almost never win. But a horse like Dream Passage fits the bill of what I'm looking for to a T.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that because a lot of times speed figures on turf are pretty representative of the class, and that does matter quite a bit on the turf. Let's move on to the next race on that Fairgrounds card. It's race 9, the New Orleans Classic, a grade 2 event going 1 1/8 on the dirt course, and seeing a lot of familiar names in this race. I know we handicapped the last couple of cards like this at the Fairgrounds where they ran the Louisiana Stakes and the Mine Shaft, and we've got some similar fields, a similar field assembled for this race with some new players, though, and I think that makes this New Orleans Classic a much more interesting race. And I wouldn't be so inclined to just concede this race to Silver Dust, even though he's won or crossed the line first, I should say, in the 2 prep races leading up to this. I think this is going to be a much taller order for Silver Dust.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm with you with Silver Dust. I'm going to go with 3 strikes and I'm out. I'm going to try to beat him once again. He just hasn't run that quick. His 2 wins this year have only been a 112 and a 115 TimeformUS speed figure. The rest of the horses who have been running behind him, horses like Gunnet and Lone Sailor and those, I'm just not interested in them. So I'm going to look at those new shooters you mentioned, and that includes Fearless for Todd Pletcher, a very lightly raced 4-year-old, undefeated in just 2 starts. I hate using that term, undefeated, for so few, but he's won both his races easy, and last time he got a 120 TimeformUS speed figure. And then we get By My Standards, last year's Louisiana Derby winner, who was unseen after the Kentucky Derby before resurfacing in February in an allowance race at the Fairgrounds, where he also won with a 120 TimeformUS. And I just think these 2 are clearly the horse to beat. It's kind of hard to say which one I prefer. I will probably play them both in exactas, and it's really just going to come down to value and how the race gets bet. Fearless is 9-2 on the morning line. By My Standard 6-1. So I think it's safe to assume they'll probably be reasonably close in the betting action. And I'm just going to see what the public does and really center my bets around these 2 horses.
Yeah, I asked for some people to submit some questions on Twitter last night for us to answer during this show. And somebody actually asked about Fearless and how we would rate him stepping up in class. And if we're wary of a horse like him who hasn't faced this kind of company, meeting a much tougher field. And I mean, what I would say about that is he did run a speed figure last time, as you said, that makes him pretty much on par with the top players in this race. The only reservation that I have with Fearless is that he did so against a really soft field last time. He had one major rival in that race, I believe, Kid Bourbon for Mark Hennig. And for whatever reason, Kid Bourbon didn't show up that day. And the rest of that field was just significantly weaker than the company he's facing. So I do want to be somewhat wary of a horse that had a pretty favorable setup last time, just in terms of the class of the race he's coming out of. I mean, he did set an honest pace that day. I don't want to, knock the performance based on that. But he is going to face a much taller order here. So I like Fearless as a horse. I just am a little wary about him stepping up in class at what could be a short price, because there are some other horses in this race that have back class that I think you have to consider. 2 other horses that you didn't mention that I gave a long look to in this race. One of them is Tenfold, who I know it's been a while since he's hit the board, and some people might look at him and say that he just hasn't really gone on since his 3-year-old season. But Tenfold's been in some pretty tough spots recently. He was in the Pegasus World Cup last time, just was going to have no chance in that race. He faced horses like Tom's d'Etat and Mr. Freeze prior to that. I know he disappointed too back in the Tenacious against some common rivals here. The pace of that race, I don't know, it didn't set up great for closers. It was over a sloppy track that Tenfold probably isn't in love with. He's probably better over a dry dirt track. We'll see how much rain Fairgrounds gets on Saturday. I know there's a little bit in the forecast, not a ton, but Tenfold's a horse that's going to be a price in this race that I don't want to totally dismiss. Another horse that I would want to use somewhere is Chess Chief, because I know he's coming off some slower recent races, but those have been some preps for a step back up into stakes company, which he's getting here. And he won really easily last time. He was beaten by a pretty good horse and Aurelius Maximus 2 back. I don't know where that horse has gone since then, but he looked to be on the verge of stepping out into stakes company soon after that performance. And going back to Chess Chief's 3-year-old season, I mean, he was right there at the end of that fast Oklahoma Derby, finishing ahead of Mucho Gusto, but not far behind a horse like Owendale. He ran some good races prior to that against Mr. Money. So Chess Chief does have the back class to be competitive here, and I think he can get the mile and an eighth distance. So I'd use him prominently. And I even would upgrade Gunnet a little bit. If I was going to take one horse coming out of that mineshaft handicap, I would much prefer Gunnet to Silver Dust, because I think Gunnet is much more inclined to improve going the mile and an eighth distance. I still have that concern about him being a little bit goofy, drifting in and out in the stretch, not changing leads. But somewhere in him, Gunnet does have that natural talent to win a race like this. So basically what I'm getting at is this would be a spread race for me.
Yeah, I hear you. And Tenfold is one horse. He's the third horse that I actually had notes on. He had that big figure in the Pegasus, also a 120 like the two other horses I talked about. To me, that's more of a suck up type figure where he didn't do a whole lot of running, but at a big price, which he's probably going to be, I'll definitely use him defensively. The one thing I do want to mention about Fearless, which I do tend to like him a little bit more than I think you did, is he's actually predicted to have a clear lead on our pace projector. I do agree he's stepping up in class and facing some more salty rivals here, but there's not a whole lot of speed among that group. So he's, it's just a race where class might not matter as much. If he finds himself a couple lengths on the lead set, running a 48.5, he could be tough to beat. So I'm more on his side, I guess, than some of the others you mentioned, but I have no problem. I think we definitely agree that we're looking at horses who are new to the group so much so than the others. And I do want to mention for like the 27th time in a row, Captivating Moon has entered in both the dirt and the turf stake in the fairgrounds. So who knows where he's going to show up.
Yeah, I'd imagine he might take a shot at this race, although it's hard to predict because that turf stakes that we're going to talk about next is pretty salty. And before I move on, I just do want to mention I didn't name By My Standards as a horse that I was using, but By My Standards, I think, is a horse that makes a ton of sense in this race. If I had to make a top pick, I'd probably consider making it be him because I was really impressed with his optional claiming victory last time. I just kind of feel like we're not going to get that 6-1 morning line on him. He seems like the kind of horse that turned a lot of heads last time, and he has that back class, having won this the feature race on this day, the Louisiana Derby last year. So I do feel like By My Standards is going to attract plenty of support in this race. But if he is, over 4-1, I think he'd be a viable win candidate. I just want to look for some better value with horses like potentially Chess Chief or Tenfold. Let's move on to that turf stakes, the Mervyn Muniz Memorial Classic. Grade 2 event going a mile and an eighth on the turf course for the older horses at the fairgrounds. And this one seems pretty wide open. We've got some horses that prepped in the local race here, the Fairground Stakes last time. Factor this won that race over Synchrony. But we've also got some shippers coming in from Gulfstream for Chad Brown, Instilled Regard, who was third most recently in the Pegasus World Cup Turf. It's a pretty competitive affair. Instilled Regard, to me, seems like the class horse in this race, coming out of those races in Florida, where he really did run well both times in the Fort Lauderdale and the Pegasus Turf. He obviously gets the mile and an eighth distance, where that's a question for some other horses in this field to have done their better work in marathon races and are cutting back. I just think Instilled Regard projects to get a pretty good trip and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'll cut to the chase. He's my top pick in this race. He's 5-1 on the morning line. I'm not sure if we'll get that or not, but I just really like this Pegasus. He's a horse who came in. He ran a 123 TimeformUS speed figure that day. The two horses that finished in front of him are horses who would both be odds on to win this race here. And I also think Instilled Regard, and I'm curious what you think about that, will probably appreciate this shorter distance a bit more than he did the mile and a 3/16 that day. He flattened out a little bit late, but I've always been one that thought he was more a mile and a 16th type horse. So I think he is definitely the one I want in here. There are a couple other interesting ones in here, as you mentioned. Factor this one last time. I don't think he's going to get quite as easy a setup as he did with Secretary of War in here. I think that one will probably challenge him for the lead. Not that Factor this has to have the lead. If he's near that 10-1 morning line, I would certainly use him. I'm just not sure that's going to happen. And Synchrony, the old veteran, 7-year-old, he ran a huge figure last time, a 127, went second to Factor This, a race we talked about on the Pacecast. He draws a tough outside post, so he's going to have to work out a trip. And it's not so much that I'm against Synchrony. I suspect he'll run well, but I just don't think he offers much value at all.
Yeah, in still regard, I do agree with you that a mile and an eighth is probably the best distance for him. I know he's just 1 for 5 on the turf, but he's the kind of horse that when he came into that Fort Lauderdale 2-back, I know we had talked about that race on the forecast. He's a horse who really deserved to have won a turf race before that because he had gotten some trips that weren't ideal a few times and had faced some really tough company facing allowance and optional claiming horses. So in still regard has been a classy turf runner for a long time. And he did get an absolutely perfect trip last time in the Pegasus World Cup turf, saving ground the entire way. And he had his chance in the stretch and just wasn't quite good enough. But I don't think it's a big knock on him that he wasn't quite good enough against horses like Zulu Alpha and Magic Wand. So I respect him a lot. Irad Ortiz will not be riding him, and he won't be riding Fearless either. He announced yesterday that he'll be taking off all his mounts for the foreseeable future, for his own protection, which I think is an admirable move to make if you have the means to make it. So I assume in still regard we'll be getting a different rider for this race, but I'm not really concerned about that. If he's participating, he's really the horse to beat. I am a little bit more optimistic than you about the chances of Synchrony. I really liked Synchrony's effort in the Fairground Stakes last time. That was that track that was just favoring horses towards the rail, favoring speed horses in a lot of races. You just had to be hugging the rail that day to have your best chance at the fairgrounds. And Synchrony was on the rail for most of his trip, but he did have to angle off in the stretch to take that shot at Factor This. And he really was running at the end of that race. Nobody else was making up any ground. If anything, Factor This was drawing away from the rest of the field. And Synchrony just kicked it into another gear to try to get to that horse. That performance signaled to me that Synchrony is rounding back into better form after a couple of off-the-board finishes that were a little bit disappointing at the end of this 2019 campaign. You know that Synchrony can get the mile and eighth distance. I'm not so concerned about the outside post position for a closer like him, and I'm not even sure how far back he's going to be in this race because the TimeformUS pace projector actually shows him as more of a stalking type. We'll see how that plays out, but he has shown the ability to race closer to the pace in the past. I think it just depends upon how he breaks and what Joe Bravo decides to do. But I do think based on raw talent, Synchrony is maybe on terms with Instilled Regard. We'll see how they bet the race, but I do like Synchrony's chances quite a bit. As for the others, I think you're banking on some horses handling the step up in class. I mean, Dot Matrix has been in great form recently, but he's improved a little bit going longer distances. I don't always love turnbacks like this. Though he did run a pretty competitive speed figure in the Ashley T. Cole against New York Breds last year, so maybe he can handle it. Aquaphobia is another horse that I think you have to consider. He really improved off the claim for Mike Maker last time in that race at Gulfstream. Obviously, this is a much tougher spot, but I think you always have to be respectful of horses that Mike Maker has on the upswing because he tends to get these horses to improve over time. I mean, was there anybody else that you were taking a look at, or did you think it was mostly about those two?
No, it's those. I did want to mention Aquaphobia because those questions you asked about somebody had brought him up, and I'm not as big a fan just because I think it's a big leap in class. I'd probably be more inclined to like this horse if it was a mile and a half race. That seems to be a real specialty with Mike Maker. Not that he's bad in these spots either, but I just think for this particular horse, he's come up against a very strong field that, if it was more a grade 3 group, I would like him a little bit more. But I really think Synchrony and Instilled Regard are probably at another level.
Yeah, one other horse I just want to mention briefly is Channel Maker. Just speaking of class horses, obviously Channel Maker would be near the top of that list because he has been competitive and actually won grade 1 races in the past. I just don't see Channel Maker as being best going this shorter distance. And also, he typically gets outrun in the early going distances of like a mile and a 16th, a mile and an eighth. And I just don't know if that's going to be the right trip for him in this field because there are some other horses that have better closing kicks than he does. And I just have trouble seeing him work out the right trip, even though I do respect him as a talented horse at this level.
Yeah, it shows how strong this is for a grade 2 that it took us this long to get around the Channel Maker, a grade 1 winner. But I'm with you in here. I just think it's too short for him. It's not really going to set up for his style. I'm sure he'll be running in the lane, but it's probably going to be too late.
We're going to skip over the Fairgrounds Oaks because that race features a heavy favorite in Finite, who I would assume that both of us have kind of reluctantly come around to at this point as one of the best 3-year-old fillies out there. I know we picked against her in the race that she ran prior to this, the Rachel Alexandra, but she just looks too tough in that Fairgrounds Oaks. So we're going to move right along to the Louisiana Derby next. And this one's a doozy. It's drawn 16 horses, an oversubscribed field. 14 will go to post, assuming that there aren't any major scratches. It's going a new distance this year of 1 mile and 3/16. It's going to be a test of stamina for a lot of these horses. There's been a lot of talk about how this race probably is no longer the traditional kind of Kentucky Derby prep that it was, but it's still a $1 million race. That's a pretty lucrative prize for the 3-year-olds. So I think winning this race in and of itself is something that a lot of these connections would desire to do. You've got to, I guess, start with the horses coming out of the local races at the fairgrounds. And that conversation probably begins with Enforceable, who ran well in both the Lecomte and ran well in the stronger division of the Risen Star, finishing second to Mr. Monomoy, who is not participating in this race. We've talked about Enforceable quite a bit on this show. The real issue with him is just getting out of the gate and getting the right trip.
It is, but even then, if he does, I'm still not really sold on him. He's probably not going to be much of a price. And while you said he does come out of the stronger division of the Risen Star, I still think overall it was a pretty weak race for a race of that stature. The figures came back really weak for both divisions. So I'm going to look elsewhere to some horses shipping in. The ones that I focused on were Wells Bayou and Royal Act. Now, admittedly, neither of those are have just outstanding jump off the page at you kind of past performances. But I did really like Wells Bayou's last race. He got a huge jump up to a 119 TimeformUS speed figure for Brad Cox, who we've mentioned earlier. We do have the question. He's stretching out a full furlong from that Southwest Stakes, but I thought he ran very well. He is in a field this big, and there is plenty of speed. The pace projector does have it flagged as a race that they expect a fast pace. But being that it's on dirt, I'm just not going to dismiss a horse just because they have speed and the pace projector says the pace will be fast. The other one for me is Royal Act. He's coming in out of the Robert Lewis at Santa Anita, where he was a close second in his first dirt try to 1,000 Words. I know 1,000 Words disappointed last time out in his race at Santa Anita when he got beat by Authentic pretty easily and dropped back. But I think it was a still fairly strong race, and I thought Royal Act ran pretty well. So for me, as a guy who makes speed figures, it's hard for me to ignore the big gap between the Risen Star Stakes and those two that we have shipping in.
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure what to do with either of these horses, the ones that you mentioned, Wells Bayou and Royal Act, because they're both coming out of races where the winners came back to run so poorly in their next starts. And I guess that makes you question the speed figures a little bit, because they were such huge improvements over their prior numbers for these two in particular, Royal Act and Wells Bayou. Wells Bayou, I think it also should be noted that last time was his first time over a fast track, having competed only over wet tracks in his prior two starts. And there is a chance that the track is going to be wet at the fairgrounds on Saturday because there's rain in the forecast. We'll see how much they ultimately get. So that's a minor concern for Wells Bayou, I think. Royal Act, I liked his race in the Robert B. Lewis last time. I mean, he didn't save any ground. He was wide around both turns. He's got a pedigree to be more of a dirt horse, which I think we touched upon a little bit last time. I just want to see him do it again. Maybe he'll be a good price in this race. I think both of these horses will be decent prices because, as you said, Enforceable is going to take some money, and the rest of this field is just so wide open. So I'll use them both kind of underneath. But to me, there were so many other horses to take a look at, some of whom are going to be even bigger prices. Just to briefly finish up Enforceable, I do think Enforceable is the horse to beat. I know he hasn't run a speed figure that makes him any kind of standout in this race yet, but he does feel like a horse to me that's going to continue to get better with added ground. I think the 1 mile and 3/16 really works out well for him. If he does break well, he has the tactical speed to get into a better position early. So I see him running well in this race. If I had to pick a horse that was most likely to hit the board, I think it would be Enforceable. We'll see if he gets the job done and actually wins the race. I mean, another race horse to take a look at is Portos, who's coming out of the Withers Stakes at Aqueduct. Say what you will about the quality of the Withers, but Portos, kind of like Enforceable, is a horse who figures to appreciate added ground here. He's kind of one of those plodding one pace types who figures to be picking up pieces at the end of this race. The pace projector does predict a fast pace, and as you were mentioning, Wells Bayou will be on the lead. I didn't see a ton of front-running speed in this race, but I do think in a field this large, you'll at least have an honest pace up front. And we'll see how that affects a horse like Portos and Enforceable. Another horse that I really want to get your take on is the expensive son of Tappet, Chestertown, and there are quite a few Tappets in this race. Chestertown, to me, feels like a horse that's going to attract a lot of support in here because he had one of those trips on the Risen Star undercard that I think everybody saw last time. Was in traffic, having to steady multiple times during that race. Barely lost at the end, but he was facing a much weaker field, and I'm just a little reticent about taking him at what I think is going to be a shorter price than that 15-1 morning line, having to step up in class.
Yeah, I mean, he's a horse that had been improving, as you would expect out of a Tappet. He had improved his speed figure 3 times in a row before that slight regression last time. But I think that one's pretty explainable given the trip. It was a very slow pace. He was at the back of the pack. We have all our fractions that they coded in blue, so it just wasn't an ideal setup at all. I definitely expect him to run better. He does seem like a bit of a wise guy horse. Having watched a bunch of, listen to podcasts and watch some previews of the race. But I'm not totally against him in here at all. It's just a matter of price. I mean, if he's double digits, he would be on my horizontal tickets. I prefer him to the Risen Star horses, believe it or not, outside of maybe Enforceable, who, like you, I do agree he's probably going to run well. I'm just not super excited to try to get a short price on it, to take a shortish price on him. So I don't really have any knocks on Chestertown. He's going to have to run faster than he ever has, but you kind of expect that with 3-year-olds, particularly a Tappet stretching out to a mile and 3/16. One thing I do want to mention is once this race is finished and we sit down to do the pace and speed figures, there probably won't be any pace figures for this race because simply they've never run this distance at the fairgrounds before, at least not in my lifetime that I'm aware of. If they have, it was a long time ago and I have no data on it. So it's something we tend to build over time to kind of get a baseline, and we're just not going to have one for this race. It's a race where you're probably going to have to look at race flow and things like that to determine what the pace was.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. And that's what happens when you run races at new distances for the first time. But I get why they made the decision. And from a handicapping standpoint, it does make this race a little bit more interesting because it does make you want to upgrade horses that really do have those stamina-oriented pedigrees. I'm going to take a shot with a more improbable, wacky horse in this race because it does feel like one of these races to me that something weird could happen, given that I don't totally trust the short prices and there's no real standout in terms of consistent form or speed figures. It just seems like a lot of horses that maybe have one big figure or some that have run consistent races but have done it in slower times. So I want to take a horse that's going to be a big price in this race that I think has a better chance than his odds will reflect. And for me, that's the number 12, Lynn's Map. He's 30-1 on the morning line. I don't know if we're going to get 30-1, but he's going to be double digits. He's going to be a pretty big price in this race. Lynn's Map is a horse that I've had an interest in for quite a while. And yeah, he's been a disappointment, but I think you can make some excuses for his races. I really still, going back to that December 21st optional claiming race, I still like that race a lot because he was facing a good field that day. Mr. Monomoy, Accessions turned out to be okay too. And Lynn's Map just had no right to win that race. He was behind a really slow pace that Mr. Monomoy was getting to set up front, and he was able to close that horse down over a sloppy track. Just love the way he finished off and leveled off and the way he strode out in that race. I don't know what happened in the Smarty Jones next time. That was a last-minute decision to even send him to that race because they had been prepping for the Lecomte. He drew a poor post position, so they kind of had to alter their plans at the last minute. I don't know if that messed him up in some fashion, but he did not run well in the Smarty Jones. Last time, though, in the Risen Star, and we actually got a Twitter question about this. Somebody wanted to know what I thought of the ride he got last time and if perhaps Corey Leonard was riding to instructions. I don't know, but I do know that taking this horse all the way back to the tail end of the field and riding him from that position probably, in retrospect, was not the best move because Lynn's Map is a horse that has a lot more tactical speed than that. And that second division of the Risen Star was a race that was really dominated towards the front end by horses who saved ground most of the way, like Modernist, who got just a perfect trip. And I don't like it all in this race because Modernist projects to get a much tougher trip from the outside post here and just hasn't run fast enough to be competitive. Now, Lynn's Map hasn't run fast enough to be competitive either, but we've seen 3-year-olds improve by leaps and bounds at this time of year. And Lynn's Map, I thought, did do a lot of running in the stretch of that Risen Star, despite being totally out of position coming to the quarter pole. I mean, he just had no chance to make up the dozen lengths that he was behind with a quarter mile to go in that race. But he was really flying past horses quickly at the end of that race, just weaving through traffic to get there and was galloping out well. Just feels like a horse that didn't get the chance to show what he really could do last time. I don't mind this rider switch to Tyler Gaffalione at all, assuming that's actually the rider switch that he's getting. I haven't seen if Tyler Gaffalione's traveling to Fairgrounds this weekend. But I do think that, as the pace projector indicates, Lynn's Map is going to be closer to the pace this time, and hopefully he can overcome that post position number 12, and he's going to be a really big price. So I just want to keep the faith with the horse that I've been a fan of in the past.
Well, I would never be one to try to talk somebody off a 30-1 shot. You make some great arguments. I know we talked about the Smarty Jones on the pace cast and several times since that it was a complete lot of horses in this race. And I just want to bring up, it's actually proven to be a race that's been pretty strong. Silver Prospector obviously came back to win his next time out, massively improving his speed figure, as did the two horses who finished directly behind Lynn's Map. Shared Sense won next time out, improving his speed figure 13 points. And Lycan, who we're going to talk about in just a little bit later, because he's running at Oaklawn, improved his speed figure, winning by 26 points. So I think we were dead right to say that race was a toss out for most people that didn't run well that day. And I can't blame anyone for throwing out his last race. That was a complete just no chance trip that he got. And hey, at 30-1, man, go for it. I love the reasoning.
All right, next let's move on to a new venue, Oaklawn Park, where we're going to take a look at another 3-year-old stakes. As you just mentioned, Craig, we have one of the horses that one of our Louisiana Derby contenders faced in that Southwest coming back in this Gazebo Stakes. We'll get to him in a little bit. But this is a pretty competitive race for the 3-year-olds, going 6 furlongs. You've got some horses coming out of optional claiming and allowance company, some horses turning back in distance. I think the focus is going to be towards the middle of the pack, where you've got 3 major players in this race, one of which is Long Weekend for Tom Amos, coming off a really visually impressive win at Sam Houston last time. Long Weekend is the kind of horse that if he repeats his last race, I think he's going to be one of the major players in here, but seems like a horse based on the pace projector that might get a lot more company up front than he did last time.
Yeah, I want to mention this is a race for actually 3 of the horses from this race are entered back in an allowance race on Sunday. So it's kind of tough to get a handle on exactly what the field's going to be. Now, 2 of those are long shots. The 1 and 2 horse, No Shirt, No Shoes, and Nucky, who are both 15-1, but also Marvin, who is the 3rd or 4th choice on the morning line, but only 4-1, so considered a major contender. But that said, it doesn't really change the horses that I like in this race. The pace projector thinks it's going to be fast up front. And that had me leaning towards Lycan, the horse I had just mentioned when we were talking about the Louisiana Derby. But it's not necessarily that I like them because of the pace projector. I think there's some other things going for him. He ran a really nice 1:11 TimeformUS speed figure last time. He did it coming from somewhat off the pace in here. And then the other horse I like is Long Weekend, who you mentioned. It's possible he's going to face some speed, but I do think he is more of a speed of the speeds type horse in here. I think he's going to definitely be able to make the lead no matter who faces him. Now, it does depend how fast he's going to have to go to do it. But both of those 2 I've mentioned come out of very strong races. Lycan's race, Echo Town and Scoring have both come back to win that race while improving their speed figures quite a bit. I think it was both of them in the 7-point range. And Long Weekend similarly comes out of a race where 2 other next out winners have come who had massive speed figure improvements of 17 points. And it's not that it's something I have to see when I like a horse, but it just usually means the race was a little stronger than even the speed figure would indicate. And for me, it's just those 2. Lycan obviously is probably going to offer more value. He's 8-1 on the morning line. He's probably a little bit more versatile. So he would be my top pick in here, but I'll definitely be using Long Weekend as well, as he just seems like a really quick 3-year-old that came off the bench running after that long layoff for Tom Amos, and he could turn out to be a very good sprinter as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely be interested to see how the pace shakes out in this race on the front end. I was a little inclined to take a shot against Long Weekend as the horse that I downgraded a little bit of those short prices, just because he got to the lead so easily last time. And I know he did set what looks like a legitimate pace. I know that there was maybe a timing error in that race, which is why we don't have pace figures for the race. But just watching that race and watching his debut, he's obviously a horse that's just really quick out of the gate. But the one time that he did have to take significant pressure was in that Saratoga Special last year, and he just completely folded his tent. So I am a little bit concerned that he's a horse that can run one of those big figures when he has an uncontested lead. Maybe he is the speed of the speed, like you said, but I just kind of want to see him do it again against a tougher field. I have no problem with Lycan. I mean, the only knock against Lycan is that last time was the right time to have him at 20-1, and he's going to be a shorter price in this race, but I don't think he's going to be that short, because I think some people might not trust that speed figure last time. That seems like it came out of nowhere for him, but as you said, that's proven to be a strong race, and I think it was a legitimate performance, so I'm definitely using Lycan, who might trip out in this race. But I do like the two horses coming out of that optional claiming race on February 2nd at Oaklawn, both Little Menace and Marvin. They finished about a neck apart, finishing first and third that day. Little Menace, to me, just really finished off that race well. He probably got the better trip, sitting in behind the speeds most of the way. But I like the way that he gamely ran down those horses in the final furlong, and what was just a blanket finish with 4 horses across the line. But those are all good horses, so I do think he can make that transition up into stakes company. And he earned a 113 TimeformUS speed figure for that performance, which I believe is the highest last out figure in this field. So that makes him a pretty solid contender. Marvin actually got a higher speed figure that day because he was contesting that pace, and he was doing it from the outside, going wide around the turn. And Marvin, to me, just seems like a horse that has a lot of grit and a lot of fight in him. I mean, I'm not sure that he's a horse that even wants to go a mile. They tried to go a mile last time, actually running once in between that optional claiming race, that Little Menace one, and this gazebo. Marvin took a real challenge from Shared Sense, who's a nice horse for Brad Cox, at about the 8th pole of that mile race last time. And he really battled on gamely to the wire. Never looked like he was going to win, but he almost did hold on because he just refused to lose. Just like that tendency that he showed 2 back in that race against Little Menace. I just think Marvin is a horse that is going to be in the fight at the end. If he's good enough to win, I don't know. The speed figures say that he probably is, but he's shown the ability to stalk in the past, and I think he's the horse that might be the best price of some of these ones that I was toying around with playing on top. So I'll take a little shot with Marvin, and like you said, he is cross-entered, but hopefully he does run in this race.
The one thing, it doesn't really affect their handicapping at all, but people may notice the purses are shrinking at Oaklawn starting on Saturday, and that's just because of their casino being closed. I think Mary Rampolini had tweeted out or maybe wrote an article. There's a 30% cut in all the purses for the time being. So if you're wondering why this is only 90,000, where that's what we've been seeing for allowance and even maiden races at Oaklawn, that is why.
Yeah, good to be aware of that. And I imagine we're going to go through a lot of that in the coming months, hearing stories that are similar to that. And hopefully that everybody can stay safe and make it through this time. And hopefully we get back to some sense of normalcy soon with all of that. Let's finish up by moving to Santa Anita this weekend. 2 stakes races are occurring there on Saturday, both of them on the turf, though. Attracting very different types of horses, one of them being a sprint race and the other being a turf marathon. We'll begin with that 5.5 furlong turf sprint, the San Simeon, a grade 3 event. And this one features one of the most talented turf sprinters in the country, if not the most talented turf sprinter, that being Bound for Nowhere. We rarely get to see Bound for Nowhere in action because it seems like he, well, as his name would suggest, often is bound for nowhere, prepping for a race and then just disappearing. But even though he comes off layoffs quite a bit, it doesn't seem to detract from his performances. He often shows up with good performances when we do get to see him. And for me, I know he's got to handle the 5.5 furlongs. He's done it in the past. He just looks better than these horses.
Yeah, I would agree. I thought this was a really interesting race, maybe the most fun race for me of the weekend to watch, while not necessarily being a great betting race. And that's because of Bound for Nowhere. I'm with you. I think he's going to be really tough to beat. We do have some other interesting chippers in here. Voodoo Song is coming in, formerly trained by Linda Rice. It looks like he's in the barn of Richard Mandela. I don't know if that's just to get him some races out west before moving back east. I guess that's something we'll have to see. But he's always a fun horse in his routes. We know he has really high speed. We have Sistron, who's a proven sprinter on both surfaces, graded stakes winner, returning from a long layoff. So it is an interesting field, but I'm with you. It is a little bit tough to get past Bound for Nowhere. He is the fastest horse in the field when he actually shows up and doesn't scratch. We'll see if he actually runs. He's certainly been working out fast. He's been working out often, so I would assume he's going to show up. My only real thing I wanted to talk about in here is I would caution people against, at least I'm going to be against a horse like Voodoo Song. It's easy to look at his races and see how fast he is routing and think he could turn back to a sprint and it would fit him just perfectly. But for me, I think a distance like 5.5 furlongs is just too short. And this is one of the few times where I actually change from pace figures to our adjusted fractions to see. And if you look at all of Voodoo Songs and his routes, he's one that his adjusted fractions usually hover right around the 23-second range. And if you look at some of the other true sprinters in here, they're more like 22. You'll even see some sub-22s. So I just think a horse like him's really going to struggle trying to keep up early with these true sprinters. And while he'll take some money, he's probably the one real opinion I have in this race that I would be against him.
Yeah, I don't like to predict things that go beyond just the normal handicapping, but I do want to say you might want to handicap this race thinking that Bound for Nowhere runs and also thinking that he doesn't run, because it should be noted those fast workouts were in Kentucky. And I know there have been a lot of travel restrictions put in place in California since just a few days ago. So I wonder if it's even possible for him to have made the trip to California. I didn't see any reporting about that, but it's just something to be aware of. And I wouldn't be picking against Bound for Nowhere if he does show up in this race. If Bound for Nowhere is not in the race, it becomes a completely different race for me. And I think you'd have to talk about the pace and reassess it, because I want to get your take on Sistron's position in the pace projector, because I'm guessing that Sistron being projected as the clear speed outside of Bound for Nowhere is based a lot on his recent dirt races, because he's not necessarily a front runner on the turf, going back to his races from 2019. And I wonder if, based on his turf efforts, Sistron would actually be faster than a horse like Surrender Now.
That's the one thing we can do in ours, and I'm doing it just now as we speak, pulling up his turf races. And he did run some pretty quick turf races. He has a 5 furlong turf race with a sub 22. He's got a 22 and 15. I'm not sure that that's really his preferred style, but he almost might get it by default in here. Surrender Now is a horse who he's made the lead, but when he's done it, he's had some blue pace figures and adjusted fractions the time he has. So I would still tend to think Sistron would be the leader. Now, I'm not as high on him because he is coming off that long layoff. It's not something that's been a strong suit of his in the past. He usually takes a couple races to get going. So I'm not saying that I would be he'd be a horse that I'd be looking to bet if Bound for Nowhere is not in there. I'm really not sure what direction I'd go, but I still wouldn't be surprised to see him up front.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you make about his turf races. Even though he hasn't been on the lead in all of them, he has been involved in some fast paces. So maybe he is just faster than Surrender Now. But I would be looking for the horse that might make the lead outside of Bound for Nowhere if Bound for Nowhere is not in the race. And that could be Sistron. Sistron, while we talked about maybe the fact that he did improve on the dirt last year, his turf races are fine, and they just make him a little bit classier than everybody else aside from Bound for Nowhere. So I would think that Sistron will be tough to beat if he is the favorite in this race. Like you, while I would love to see Voodoo Song do well just as a fan of the horse, I have trouble seeing him being competitive against this field. He doesn't have the speed to keep up with horses like Sistron and Surrender Now in the early going, and he's not shown to be a horse that is that comfortable passing horses. So to me, this just feels like a prep race for Richard Mandela, and we'd probably see him going longer in the future. The one other horse I want to mention that has a chance is Mourad Khan. He would need some pace to close into, and maybe he'd even be better served if Bound for Nowhere was in the race, because he would ensure that the pace is a little bit faster. But Mourad Khan was really impressive last time, winning that 5.5 furlong turf sprint. I know he wasn't facing the toughest company, but that was the first time that they turned him back to sprinting, perhaps ever. And he ran a nice race that day. He was really finishing well to close down that field, despite the fact that the pace really wasn't that fast and didn't necessarily set up for a closer. He just might be a horse that's finding himself as a turf sprinter. So I don't want to totally discount him as kind of the new face wild card in this race. But I do think Bound for Nowhere and Sistron seem like the right two horses.
Yeah, I agree with you with Mourad Khan. If the pace does get hot, he would certainly be the one I'd want. And I might be on the other side of the fence of that, where things might be a little more up in the air if Bound for Nowhere doesn't show up. And maybe he'd have a better shot if a few of the others threw down and they're just not quite of the same quality. But, it's just going to be, like I said, it's not a race I'm really thrilled to bet, but it's going to be a fun race to watch for me for the most part.
Let's close things out on this podcast with that second race we're going to talk about from Santa Anita on Saturday, the San Luis Rey, going 1.5 miles, starting on that downhill turf course before they connect up with the main track on the turf at Santa Anita. And this field, it's a grade 3 event. It's probably barely a grade 3 quality race because you do have Oscar Dominguez in here, who's he was a grade 2 winner at the end of last season, but he's often a horse that just picks up checks in these races. This time, though, I think Oscar Dominguez is clearly the horse to beat because he's got those proven class lines in a race where others just haven't quite proven their quality going these marathon distances.
We see it somewhat similar, but I think it's a 2-horse race, basically. I have it narrowed down to Oscar Dominguez and Warden Jerry. I do think Oscar Dominguez is the horse to beat. I thought there would be a little bigger disparity when I first looked at this race for out of the gate yesterday in the morning line odds, but they're pretty tight with Oscar Dominguez 9-5 and Warden Jerry 2-1. The reason I looked at Warden Jerry a little bit is I think he is just a horse who really, really likes these longer distances. Whenever he runs 1 3/8, 1.5 miles, he seems to run his best races. Even 1.25 miles, he's had some wins. And when he drops below that, he's never been particularly good. He doesn't do much running at all. But last time out in the Unusual Heat Turf Classic, admittedly a state-bred race, but I don't think there's a whole lot of difference in class with this race, to be honest. He actually did some running in that race. He stayed up closer to the pace than usual. And while he was no match for Wound Tight that day, he was able to get second. So I don't think it's a walkover for Oscar Dominguez. I wouldn't single him. I would use Warden Jerry somewhat. The other horses I kind of looked at, I guess you could make a case for Ashley Love Sugar will improve on the stretch out, but I'm not particularly optimistic in that. He had been fine at shorter distances before, and it just seems to have lost a step as he's gotten older, or even 2, and isn't quite the same horse he used to be. And then the third choice in the morning line, Camino del Paraiso, I guess is how you say it. This just feels more like a distance experiment to me, taking a shot in what's a weak race more than the connections, thinking he's won at 1.5 miles all along. It just seems like a stretch to me, and he's one I don't want any part of at a short price.
Yeah, we actually see this race very similarly. I don't want Camino del Paraiso at all. He doesn't seem like a horse that wants 1.5 miles at all. If I was going to bet this race, I would probably take a shot with Ashley Love Sugar, just because he's going to be by far the best price of those 3 contenders you mentioned. And as you alluded to, it's going to be the first time that he's getting to go the distance that he really prefers since he's returned from that summer layoff last year. And I do think he is a horse that really is better going 1.25 miles to especially 1.5 miles. Yes, he's not the horse that he once was, but the horse that he once was, which has crushed this field. Even if he gets back to the races that he was running at this time last year, like in that optional claiming race behind Marquis Water, or even that Charles Winningham, he'd be tough for this field to handle. And I do hope that Brees Blanc changes up the tactics a little bit and puts him in a more forwardly placed position, because I don't think he's a horse that really wants to be coming from that far off the pace. And he's had to do it in some of those shorter races because he's just not quick enough to keep up early. But there's really no confirmed front runner in this race outside of, I don't know, maybe the 1, Swamp Souffle, and I guess the 5, Go for a Ride, though they're both really not at the class level of other horses in this field. So I think there's an opportunity for Brees Blanc to be a bit more aggressive with Ashley Love Sugar. And if he gets the jump on deep closers like, well, especially Oscar Dominguez and even Warden Jerry, who comes from mid-pack, that could give him the advantage. It's going to be a better price, so I would just lean in that direction.
Yeah, no problem with that. And you bring up a good point about the pace projector. We make one for every race, but this is one of the more shaky ones. It's kind of a total crapshoot in here. I guess Go for a Ride. He's been in some races with red fractions at shorter distances, so he's shown on the lead. But when you get out to 1.5 miles, a lot of it is determined by jockey tactics. Let's just say these horses are pretty cheap compared to the others, not quite as classy. So even if a horse like Ashley Love Sugar doesn't necessarily go up and fight them for the lead, it's a spot where you could just get the jump by laying closest to him over the other contenders. So interesting tactical race, probably not a lot of value in here, but no problem with Ashley Love Sugar. Any kind of return to his best form would certainly make him a strong contender in here. He's now 9 years old. So like I said, I will probably be against, but I can see why you like him.
Yeah, I agree with your sentiment about that, including about how it's not the most enticing wagering race. But if I had to make a wager, it would probably be on that horse just to get a little bit of value. Well, that's all the racing we're going to talk about this week. Hopefully, we'll be on next week to at least recap these races on the TimeformUS Pacecast. That seems somewhat likely. We'll see if there's racing to a handicap for the following week, a week from now on Friday when we do the TimeformUS Forecast again. But things are changing so much in just a week's time. It's hard to imagine the state that we were in just a couple of weeks ago. So we'll see how things keep developing, and we'll obviously be sharing our handicapping opinions if that is the case. And we are still in action next weekend. But as always, thanks for listening. You can check us out anytime on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Forum to get this content. So thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back to recap these races on Tuesday.